Our first session, the main topic is Christianity in the Chinese society, and our first distinguished speaker is Professor Yang Huilin, who is professor of the School of Liberal Arts and director of the Institute for the Study of Christian Culture at Renmin University of China, a member of the Disciplinary Review Committee of the State of Council of China, and panel member of the National Social Science Foundation of China. His research areas include Western literary critical theories, comparative literature, and religious studies. Among his major publications, we mention the Word of God and Words of Men, Theological Hermeneutics, Meaning, At the Boundary of Literature and Theology, Christianity in China, the work of Yang Huilin in English, and China, Christianity, and the Question of Culture, also in English. He will talk about Diffusion and Kerygma, a reflection of Erik Zurcher's The Buddhist Conquest of China. Professor Yang, you have the floor. Thank you.
Good morning, and thank you everybody for your coming. I think it's really quite a special honor for me to be arranged as a first speaker. So to be honest, I did my homework very carefully. And even on my way here from Beijing, I revised the text of my presentation on the flight and make it simplified into the form of a PPT. So I hope it could be helpful for you, and I will just try to read whatever has been prepared. If necessary, I think the full text of my presentation in English and in Chinese have been delivered to the organizers of this conference. So if necessary, please use it as your reference. As first of all, I think I should give a very brief explanation about the two crucial terms. One is diffusion, and the other is kerygma. So kerygma, in English, normally equivalent to preaching, is used side by side with didash, which means applying teachings, moral teachings, normally in daily life. So as it is quoted from the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus went throughout Galilee, teaching in their synagogues, preaching the good news of the kingdom. So in the comparison of the two terms, we may tell the difference of teaching and the preaching. Yeah. And so compared with the two terms, I think we could be sure that kerygma contains an evident meaning of proclaiming the word of God. But anyway, on the other hand, a kerygma as a predicative description of proclamation also implies that the word of God is actually proclaimed or preached only in a limited way, namely in the words of our human beings. So I think that is why preaching appeared in the biblical verses as the following sentences. The first is, if Christ has not been raised, our preaching is useless. And another is that my message and my preaching is just to demonstrate the power of the Spirit. So the next term is diffusion. I use this term in phrase of a scholar in Netherlands, Erik, who is also the author of the Buddhist Conquest of China. I took this term especially in one of his interesting papers, that is a comparative studies of the spread of Buddhism and Christianity in China, with a special subtitle like this, the spontaneous diffusion versus guided propagation, which is included in the newly published collection of his papers. In his arguments, we could indeed find the parallel of diffusion and the kerygma Buddhism and Christianity, or success and failure. So he repeated time and again such questions. Why it is that the foreign religion, such as Buddhism, succeeded in implanting itself in Chinese soul, and why Christianity failed. A similar question is that why did Buddhism become a permanent component in Chinese culture, whereas Christianity can never become more than just a temporary and a marginal phenomenon? So I think the author listed the common answers to his questions. For instance, the rice controversial in China, between China and Vatican, maybe, and Sino-centrism in the Ming and the Qing dynasties, or in compatibility between Christian concepts and Chinese philosophy. But rcher himself advocated another partial explanation in this way. He said the different choices could be found between two things. One is a spontaneous diffusion, and the other is guided propagation. I think propagation could be here understood as kerygma, especially in the earlier translation of this term into Chinese, that is 出传, which means first evangelical or evangelistic effort of preaching the good news to the Gentiles. So diffusion does not necessarily mean Buddhism or the Buddhist success in China, but diffused or institutionalized religions are surely regarded as a basic difference between the Western and the Eastern form of religions. We could find the similar terms in the writings of many scholars, for instance, C.K. Yang and Li Yiyuan, a scholar in Taiwan. The Chinese terms 分散性 or 普化性 were actually translated from the English term diffused religion. So I think in this sense, diffusion, kerygma, potentially refers to the various forms of climate spirit in the East and in the West. Oh, sorry. So Christianity and Buddhism were actually confronted with similar problems in Chinese social political context, such as the ancestral worship and marriage and whatever. But the result seems to be completely different. So it is quite common and not surprising to have success failure questions frequently. Even the Catholic theologian Hans Küng put up his questions in a similar way. He asked why Christianity has only conquered about 5% of the Asian population, given the fact that the Asian takes 2/3 of the world population, and the Catholic missionaries have been preaching the good news in Asia for several centuries. Anyway, I think the focus and the main concerns in these issues have been gradually changed, because many scholars believed that we cannot regard Chinese Buddhism as a simple transplantation of Indian Buddhism. It is in fact a grafting. So my question is, why and how is Buddhism in China not taken as a foreign religion? So I listed some quotations from the representative leading scholars in China. The first one is Fang Litian, who was my professor when I studied for PhD. He said Chinese traditional scholarship were composed or accustomed to three things. The first is Zhang Shu, that means clarify and comment on the classical texts. The second is Ge Yi, compare the texts to understand the principles. And the last one is Pan Jiao, which means to evaluate and judge the related teachings. In other words, it is to employ Chinese philosophical concepts, ideas, and terms to interpret, edit, and redact the Buddhist scriptures in China. So Professor Fang Litian quoted another professor who belongs to an earlier generation, Chen Yinque. He said, Confucian scholars took the essence and content of Buddhism without the names and the labels of Buddhism. So that means to keep the jewelry and return the box. So at the same time, the Chinese scholars also adopted Buddhist thought to interpret Chinese classics. So Professor Chen Yinque believed that superficially, it is to venerate Confucius and despise Buddha. But in fact, Buddhism became fully permitted into Confucianism and merged with Confucianism as one thing. So another quotation is from Shi Jun, who is a professor in my university and also in Peking University. He said, since Song Dynasty, the popularity of Buddhism has been provided by Confucianism, and Confucianism has been greatly enriched by Buddhism. So such a kind of diffusion, I think, is not an ordinary diffusion. It's a diffusion of thought on a deeper level, which has mutually enhanced the development of both Christianity, Confucianism and Buddhism in China. So not only did Confucianism develop the Song Ming New Confucianism, which is distantly different from the original form of Confucianism, but Buddhism gave birth to several new schools or sects, such as Tiantai Buddhism, Huayan Buddhism, Pure Land Buddhism, Jingtu Zong, and Chan Buddhism, Chanzong, and so on, representing diverse expressions of Chinese Buddhism. So this process of mutual enhancement, I should appreciate because I borrowed this term from Dr. Chen Jianguang. I think it's a very good word, mutual enhancement. This process has nothing to do with a religious or non-religious conversion in the history, because none of them aimed to convert the other's faith, but each of them took what is needed at a methodological level, I think. So it is also the attitude, typical attitude of Chinese people toward Western ideas in the later modern China. So the dialogue between the Buddhism and the Christianity could be traced almost in the every beginning for the encounters of the two foreign religions. So namely, it is it was started at the time of Assyrian Church of East entered the Tang Empire. The Assyrian Church of Eastern, commonly labeled as Nestorians. So I just use Nestorians as a brief form. The conceptual system of Buddhism was even the earliest interpretive framework or structure that Christian thought relied on in China. Hence, the written scriptures of Nestorians frequently use Buddhist terminology to translate Christian ideas. For instance, God was translated as Buddha, and baptism was translated as initiation into monkhood or nunhood, and so and so. And the most interesting case is this: Jesus Christ, the name of the Jesus Christ, was originally translated as Yishu. If we translate it word by word, it means a moving rat, which seems to be quite strange because we understand that Chinese people normally just choose the beautiful word in the translation of the names of whatever necessary. So, for instance, Italy, we use three very beautiful words, sound beautiful. And America, Meilijian and Europe, and we never use the bad word. But Yishu seems to be quite strange. Yeah. But anyway, in accordance with the Buddhist scriptures, white rat is a metaphor of daytime, and the black rat implies for the night. So someone believes that the moving rat probably means the rat who move the day and night, which might be a Buddhist way to express the Christian idea of the creation. So even after the Buddhism was suppressed in the later times, some of the Nestorian classics that had become scattered were mistakenly regarded as Buddhist classics, and as such were preserved for posterity in Dunhuang, together with the Buddhist scriptures. Yeah. So I will show you some pictures in order to make the lecture not so boring. This is a typical case for the diffusion of Buddhism. We take this picture from the Wutai mountain in Shanxi province. It is recorded that in such a not so large mountain area, there used to be over 200 Buddhist temples. Even now, I think at least 50 or 60 survived still. And we could find a poetic couplet in one of the temples there. That means, 山色归真境，琴声出慧林. I translated the word, tried to translate the word by word. The color of mountain implies the ultimate. The sounds of birds come from the wisdom forest. Please just notice the last two words, which is exactly my name. Yeah. I think the poetic couplet is where my name came from. But to be honest, my family has nothing to do with Buddhism. Yeah. So I think that is a case for the diffusion of Buddhism. Without our consciousness, we are, could be possibly influenced by its tradition. Yeah. And other pictures also show the transformation and a generation of how to change the India Buddhism into Chinese one. Yeah. You can notice different styles and materials, bricks and colors and whatever. Yeah. The first two pictures are typically India one, but the last one is, of course, a Chinese tower of Buddhism in the temple. And this is a sculpture of Manjari Bodhisattva. Yeah. The first one is also in a typical India style, but the later one becomes a Chinese sculpture. Yeah. It's quite interesting that even in the Catholic cathedral in Beijing, you may find this picture. It is called the Chinese Maria, quite famous in the West, I think. Yeah. And I was very surprised to find that Maria and the young Jesus were dressed in yellow. The yellow is not an ordinary color. I think ordinary people cannot be dressed in this way. Yeah. And you may also find some dragons and phoenix, and almost everything is a symbol of royal family. But it is believed to be not Cixi Empress and the young emperor, but it is Chinese Maria. So another case I would like to say is about the deviation in the diffusion of thought. So let's be back to the quotation of Fang Litian. He mentioned another subtle sense of diffusion. That is Chinese philosophy, Chinese mindset, and the national mentality are rich in secular humanism. So which is very different from India religious culture and religious tradition. So for Professor Fang, he believed that Buddhism is an atheistic religion or non-theistic religion that does not set theistic worship as its core doctrine. So that is a part of the what I call the deviation. Yeah. The deviation resulted from the diffusion is probably not only limited in Chinese culture. So I listed several cases in the West. The first is a theologian, W.C. Smith, who advocated a word theology. And along with his track, you may find some references from philosophers like Zizek and the so-called materialist theology of Zizek, which is also known as atheistic theology. And another famous scholar is from Italy, Gianni Vattimo. He asserted that perhaps true Christianity must be non-religious. And Roland Bohr, a scholar from Australia, he tried to argue why Marxist and atheist should have theological expression. I like these quotations because only in accordance with the discussions of such scholars, I think I could find legitimacy to talk about the theology. And in China, another case is from a contemporary writer, rcher, who passed away several years ago. He published a quite interesting paper, an article entitled Believing in Christ During the Daytime and Trusting in Buddha at Night, which is a description of the form of religious practice in China for many ordinary people, maybe including himself. He said that Christianity suits more for those who faces the daytime that is filled with sufferings, but day is day, night is night. So apart from one religious tradition, we may need several others. So in regard with a faith conflict, rcher wrote in this, he said, people may destroy the world because of their faith, and are also able to make the world better because of their faith. People can be arrogant towards others because of their faith, and can also be humble because of their faith. They can fight for their faith, and they can also help strangers unconditionally because of their faith, as long as a pre-assurance of God is on our side. Such a logic could be given up. So this article is composed in the dialogic form. So one put up such a question. Does it mean that there's no way out for a good person if we have to give up whatever we believe? We have to give up our pre-assurance. The answer is no. Only a good person can give up a pre-assurance. Only a good person can see how difficult it is to give up this pre-assurance, and thus believe that no matter how difficult it could be, he or she needs to give it up, give up the pre-assurance. So if I could give a brief summary for the presentation, I would say it has been always in the procedure of generational transformation, talking about tradition, culture, whatever, which is impacting and being impacted by others, constitutive as well as to be constituted by different things, but never stays in its original state. So Chinese culture might be the most typical case for the fusion or diffusion of nationalities, traditions, and which gets a lot of resources from other cultures and makes the borrowed and learned things internalized into our own culture, own tradition. So in the operation and the function of mutual interpretation, mutual understanding, and mutual reflection, I think it is not impossible to turn contradiction into contrariety. So to change the word, when we interpret others, we are also interpreted by others. And when we translate a text, we might be also translated by the text. So if I could go on with my conclusion in the quotation of Pope Francis, I would say maybe last year or 2 years before, he offered a very extraordinary remark, which has been published in the Journal for the Study of Christian Culture, published by my university. I think the main points could be described as 3 things. The first is dialogue does not necessarily mean compromise or fully giving up oneself. But the second, while spreading the good news in Kerygma or whatever, it is not to convert people from other religions or traditions. And finally, what we need most is to walk together in our differences. So the last one is a picture I took from the campus of my university. I hope one day I could receive my honorable guests and the scholars from this university there. And I use just a line which is also my favorite thing. Language makes us different from one another, but the dialogue in different languages makes it possible to understand each other and understand ourselves better. Thank you.
I'm now pleased to give the floor to Dr. Marco Lazzarotti, who is the respondent, who's responding to Professor Yang's presentation. Marco Lazzarotti obtained his doctoral degree in anthropology at the Heidelberg University. His research deals with the effect of Catholicism on the tradition of ancestor rites in Taiwan, interreligious and intercultural dialogue, up to the modernization of funeral rites in Taiwan. He's currently working on the publication of a book, Telling Stories Makes the World, Place, Alterity, and Narration in a Taiwanese Catholic Village, which is forthcoming. He has been selected as a member of the Phi Tau Phi Scholastic Honor Society in Taiwan. So I'm very pleased to give the floor to you for your response. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And, okay, thank you. Yeah. Thank you and good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Well, first of all, I would like to thank the university, the Gregoriana University, for this exciting opportunity. And also, I would like to thank Professor Yang Huiling for this exciting paper. And I found, I mean, when I read it, I found it really stimulating. And I would like, with my response, to maybe suggest a few thoughts that I hope can become an help for Professor Yang paper and also for a further discussion on this topic. Well, diffusion and kerygma are the main guidelines that Professor Yang uses to describe the different ways of spread the two religions, Buddhist and Christianity, in China. This schema is linked with Erik's question: why did Buddhism become a permanent and component part in Chinese culture, while Christianity can never become a permanent component in Chinese culture? Cannot never become more than just a temporary, this is the right word he used, temporary and marginal phenomenon. Well, from a first reading of the dichotomies diffusion kerygma and Buddhist Christianity, it becomes evident that there is a third dichotomy that could be pulled together with the first two. And I'm talking about this success-failure dichotomy. And before starting my response, I would like to underline a couple of concepts expressed by Professor Yang, which I think are central also to my response. Firstly, the concept that the adaptation between Confucianism and Buddhism has been bi-directional. And the other concept is the concept of deviation. Namely, in the paper I read as the changes that occurred both to Confucianism and Buddhism within this long historical process. Well, it seems to me that one of the ways to approach the construction of these dichotomies is to stress the role of the concept of authenticity within the process of transmission. And with process of transmission, I refer to the process used, within a communication context to refer an idea from a transmitter to a receiver. In the process of evangelization of China, the authenticity of the message is strongly linked with what we may call the guardians of tradition. Within the structure of the church, it is possible to recognize the clergy as the depositary of the idea of authenticity, and thus as the effective guardians of tradition. So, this structure, the clergy, is also what connects the local church with the universal one. It is interesting to note how in this view, the links, the missionaries who operate in China, it's always something located outside of China. So, because especially at the beginning, the centers of the various religious orders were in Europe, or at least in other Asian countries. For example, Manila, Goa, or Macau. These religious orders were in turn subject to the various ecclesiastical congregations in Rome, and ultimately, of course, to the Pope. So compared to the concept of diffusion, all this complex structure could be identified as one of the causes that relegated Christianity to play a role of marginal phenomenon in China. But, if I'm allowed to ask a few questions from the point of view of an anthropologist, how is success defined within a context of religion and cultural exchange? It is possible to do it. Which are the elements that allow us to define the success or the failure of this kind of process? Using a more dialogical reference system, as Professor Yang actually suggested, instead of a dichotomous approach, could be very useful, I think, to clarify the interrogatives introduced by my questions. In recent years, Nicholas Stendhart argued that the model of Christianity which Matteo Ricci introduced to China cannot be said as a failure. This because what Matteo Ricci and the Chinese partners and friends created was a cultural contact between West and East that should be studied in a more encompassing framework than the three which historiographers usually apply it, namely a transmission framework, reception framework, and invention framework. Just to give an idea, the transmission framework answers to the question, how did the European missionaries transmit their message to China? With the transmitter as the primary protagonist, the observer, maybe an historian, an historiographer, even an anthropologist, cannot account for the changes and the adaptations that the missionaries needed to make in order to be accepted. The receiver framework put the focus on Chinese people, but the problem of this framework is that the receiver is basically passive. It exists only in relation to the transmitter in a schema of action and reaction. And within the invention framework, which is basically in Foucault idea and studies on power, the observer recognizes the creativity and freedom of the missionary in shaping and choosing the format of the transmitted message. However, that perception is still trapped in a reductionism that streamlines communication to what happens between the messenger transmitter and the message itself. What Standard proposed is a further step, which represents a strong methodological shift from the search of the other to the search of a space of interaction. And this because, quoting, missionaries arriving in China created a space of interaction that led to the reframing of that space wherein traditional actions and ideas are reconceived. Therefore, the focus is neither on the transmitter and nor on the receiver, but on what is in between. So, while looking for a space of interaction, we can discover how the fruit of the enculturation by Chinese Christians was the effective creation of Chinese Christian communities with a specific Chinese Christian thought, which means also a theology that incorporates Christian and Confucian concepts, and with a specific way of celebrating liturgies and rituals. I think that in order to analyze and interpret the Kerygma of the Catholic Church, it is first necessary to understand the composition of these Chinese Christian communities. And this could be done only by putting the relationships between transmitter, the missionary, and the receivers, the Chinese people, inside a wider frame. It is necessary to decompose the dialogical frame by creating a bigger and thus, of course, complex space of interaction. Concretely, I propose to add a third vertex to the two elements which traditionally compose the above-mentioned dialogical frame. So we have the missionaries, we have the Chinese Christians, and also we have the Chinese people who did not accept Christianity. If we think in this way, we can see how all the three elements are constitutive of the dialogue, because each element influenced the other two. I will argue that this dialogue is actually the hard core of the Kerygma, which should be considered as bi-directional process, like the diffusion process described by Professor Yang. Or maybe it's better to say tri-directional process. Anyway, one of the things that Professor Yang pointed out toward the end of his fascinating paper is that the diffusion process of Buddhists has been this kind of bi-directional approach. So in order to formulate this convincing assumption, Professor Yang offered the example of how Buddhists reinterpreted by the cultural elites of the Song and Ming dynasties influenced Confucian thought and was in turn influenced by it. I think that Professor Yang is right in underlying the importance of these elites in the process of dissemination of Buddhists in China, and especially during the Song and Ming dynasty, actually. But I would like to offer another perspective, the perspective of a cultural anthropologist. Just to give an example, Stephen Taser, another American professor, demonstrated how the Buddhist rite known as Yulen Pen Hui, which is a ritual offering to the dead on the 15 days of the 7th lunar month. This ritual in China is grounded in pre-Buddhist understanding of the significance of this date in the lunar calendar. And its performance in medieval times linked together elements of society and culture well behind the strictly Buddhist orbit. There were thus two bidirectional exchanges and assimilation played both in a symbolic level and at the level of the everyday practices. In other words, the bidirectional exchange was linked not only to the relationships between Buddhist and Confucianism constructed by the elites, but also to the relations between Buddhist and local culture constructed by all the community linked with a specific temple or a specific group of monks. At this point, we can see how both Kerygma and diffusion should be considered as a kind of cultural encounter that is not understandable only in terms of the analysis and comparison of their respective cosmology or theologies. Therefore should play a very important role in a cultural system, but as Clifford Geertz pointed out, the disposition dictated by the religious concept coexist at the same time with other disposition dictated by practical activities linked to the social environment, to the political system, to the financial situation, and last but not least, to the everyday practices linked with that specific religion. The concept of religion falls within the bounds of a wider symbolic system that we call culture. Following Geertz, I quote, we can try to define religion as a cultural system, where culture means an historically transmitted pattern of meaning embodied in symbols, a system of inherited conceptions expressed in symbolic forms by means on which men communicate, perpetuate, and develop their knowledge about attitudes toward life. So meanings, according to this definition, are embodied in symbols, and these symbols are historically transmitted. But because history cannot belong to only one person, it follows that these patterns of meanings are public, belongs to a community. In other words, these patterns of meaning are public. So still following Gertz, we can consider these meanings as historically constructed, socially maintained, and individually applied. And I think that it is individual application of this symbolical background that, in my view, stimulate this kind of cultural dialogue, and that therefore enable us to address ourselves toward a personal analysis of the cultural contact. I use the term personal because the two religions meet each other in the space represented by persons. And in this space, they start a dialectical and meaningful process based on conflict and compromises. This happens because persons can dialogue and meet each other, not cultures. They do this only throughout persons. Trying to conclude my speech, I think that in order to analyze and interpret the Kerygma of the Catholic Church within the Chinese context, it would be useful to take several steps. First of all, to reconsider the dichotomy, diffusion, Kerygma, without taking the idea of success or failure as an analytical category. And the second step, it will be useful to open for me, I think, for an anthropologist at least, this kind of research to the study of human interactions, which contributes, as I try to demonstrate, to the realization of Kerygma, which is at the end of the day a dialogical approach. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lazzarotti, for this, I would say, punctual and meticulous responses to the various insights raised by the presentation of Professor Yang. So I think now we can, we have some time for the discussion session. We have actually nearly 45 minutes. So I'm pleased to open the floor for any question, comment, reaction. If you could maybe identify yourself and then in case specify whom your question or comment is directed to, we can maybe collect a few of them and then have a response from our distinguished panelists.
Thank you very much. My name is Agus Riono. I'm the Indonesian ambassador to the Holy See. First of all, I would like to appreciate to the presentation made by Professor Yang Hulin, and I'm personally very interested with your presentation. My question is only one. How far is the Chinese tradition and Chinese culture can accept the idea of Christianity? Because in my country, in Indonesia, sometimes for most of the Indonesian community who are Muslims, they have their own thinking, they have their own culture, tradition. It is not easy for the Indonesian traditionals accept the values of Christianity. So once again, my question is, how far is the Chinese culture or tradition can accept the values of Christianity? Thank you.
Okay, Professor Yang.
So, thank you for the question. Before that, I think I should give my appreciation to Professor Lazzarotti To be honest, I misunderstand your name with another, Lazaroto. And I found that only one character is different. Yeah. And his response reminds me of the fact that someone believed that philosophy is not a dialogue. Why? Several years ago, Alain Badiou, a French philosopher, and Zizek had a dialogue. And after the presentation of Alain Badiou, Zizek were asked to respond to the presentation. And he said, I cannot have a dialogue with Alain Badiou because principally we are in agreement. Yeah. But anyway, I really learned a lot from your response. For instance, the insights you quoted from Nicholas Standard, who is also my friend, and his analysis about the influence of Martellizzi and the Jesuits is quite interesting. And on the other hand, you also mentioned the meaning, the structure of meaning, historically structured and sociologically maintained, and personally, individually applied. Yeah. So I will read carefully about the text of your response. Thank you. And in regard with your question, I think if I could say very briefly, I would like to mention some evaluation from Qian Mu. Qian Mu is also a quite influential philosopher in China. He said that the very beginning of modern Chinese academia, you may find many cases for the new reinterpretation of Chinese thought in accordance with Western metaphysical grammar or metaphysical logic. So I think that is a potentiality for Chinese tradition or Chinese Confucianism to accept Western ideas, including Christian ideas. But anyway, I have to say that as a scholar, I do not think the crucial thing for Christianity is only the terminology of the preaching. I prefer to understand the terminology in a philosophical way. Yeah. Because I think it is quite hard to separate Christian tradition from the philosophical tradition in the West. So for scholars, if we could try to keep our distance with religious identification, I think it is not impossible for many of us to accept the ideas, the logic, whatever I call the metaphysics. Yeah, thank you.
Perhaps because before we go on with your questions, because we have some time, I had myself annotated a few remarks from these two very interesting presentations, which I would like to maybe point out to and maybe can help the discussion. So the different pathways and developments of Buddhism and Christianity in China, whereby Buddhism went through a process of implantation and Christianity still remains as a marginal, even foreign religion. The spontaneous diffusion versus guided propagation modalities of the two religions in China, integration and merging of Confucianism and Buddhism, the challenges of engaging in cultural dialogue between Christianity and Chinese cultural traditions, and the benefits that this could lead to in terms of mutually beneficial or mutually enhancing exchange and development and perhaps working together. This space of interaction that the missionaries created, you quoted from Standard, and the fact that the focus is now no more on the transmitter and the receiver of the message, but rather what it is in between, and opens up a space of interpretation. And a final point would be the contribution of local communities to this bidirectional exchange and mutual enhancement, which is, I think, an elaboration from of the insights by Professor Yang. So, any further questions or reactions, please?
My name is Wu Tianyue. I come from Peking University. I'm a philosopher. I have a question for two speakers. The first one for Professor Yang Huilin. And it seems that Buddhism in China became non-religious, especially among Chinese intellectuals or among the elite class of ancient China. So my question is it a necessary condition for a foreign religion to be diffused in China? So I mean to become non-religious. Is that a necessary condition? Okay, so the question for Dr. Lazzarotti is about the concept of authenticity. Could you elaborate a little bit on this concept? Is it a Heideggerian concept or something else? And especially I'm interested in how to maintain authenticity of Christian faith or one's concept of truth in the space of interaction, especially the interactions between missionaries and Chinese Christians and non-Chinese Christians. Okay, thank you.
Okay, Professor Yang, over to you, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Wei Ting. I think, of course, it is not a necessary condition. Anyway, in accordance with some detailed analysis of Buddhist scholars, such as Fang Litian and others, you could tell the difference between the elite form of Buddhism in China and the popular form. And in accordance with his idea, the elite form is always a controlling force in China related to Buddhist affairs. So that is a quite interesting question. If the scholars, intellectuals, really take Buddhism as a religious form or a cultural tradition, or even a mindset of philosophical ideas. So, as many mentioned, that the Chinese tradition, the first step for Chinese tradition to accept Buddhist influence is not started with popular influence in the daily life, but from the intellectuals study, the academic study in the philosophical form of Buddhism. Like Qin Yinque mentioned that the metaphysical ideas in philosophy is just what is lacked in Chinese tradition in some way, especially for Confucianism. So that is why some intellectuals took the jewelry and turned back the box. Yeah. And it is not only the remark by Qin Yinque. Some translators of earlier Buddhist scriptures also remarked in a similar way. They said Chinese intellectuals just take some kernel things from India Buddhist, but the others, they turned back. They don't care. They do not think it is the crucial point for the Buddhist tradition. So that is why I think the non-religious form of Christianity is also possible and in accordance with the experience of the so-called non-theistic Buddhism. Yeah. But it is not, of course, not a necessary condition. Yeah. Thank you.
On authenticity and please.
Yeah, first of all, thank you for the question. And I mean, no, when I pointed out this idea of authenticity, I was not thinking of any particular philosophers. I just had on my mind, well, what the history also of the Catholic Church teaches us, because I mean, all the councils of the Church, the schisms, even, I mean, are linked to this idea, no? Just sit together and see what is authentic, what is, in Chinese, Zen. And so this, and how can you keep this authenticity in this concept of space of interaction? Well, I think that first of all it's necessary to define authenticity. I mean, because also Christianity is something that have been imported in West Europe, in Rome. I mean, it's coming from the East actually, and then went through a process of adaptation and acculturation here in Europe. So I think that this kind of authenticity is something linked with this idea. That's why I pointed out these guardians of traditions. Because, I mean, you have your local adaptation, but you have, this is I mean, it's like a coin. You have always two faces. You have the local church and you have the universal church. What is the universal church? This would be another question interesting to ask or to answer. So, yeah, I mean, it depends on how we can define authenticity. It's something that, if we have in mind, like sometime when we talk about culture, this is, I think, this is the risk that we are going to undertake, because sometimes we talk about culture like something that should be authentic, something quite concrete, like these things that we can take it and put in another place and nobody can touch it. But I mean, something more than this, something more linked with I try to say it, with the everyday lives of people. So it's something that you cannot define unless in a specific time, in a specific place, but I still have doubts about it. Anyway, so this is the concept of authenticity, I think.
My name is Yuda Fu from Shandong University, the Center for Judaic and Interreligious Studies. I have a question for Professor Yang Huilin. And thank you very much for your presentation. But you remind me of a standard. I mean, in what standard of us to make a judgment whether this religion or that religion developed well or faster. And this morning, the bishop from Hong Kong reminded us to think about, give some consideration about the quality and the number. So maybe from the viewpoint of number, the Christian believers are not so many as Buddhist believers. In this sense, Christianity is some kind of failure and Buddhism is more successful. But we leave aside this standard, think about the quality, maybe we would reach some different conclusion. And you also remind me of the development of Christianity in the past 35 years. I mean, after the opening policy, and Christianity became prosperous, many Chinese people convert to Christianity. So I think it's to measure a religion developed well or not should also concern some other elements, not only philosophically, culturally, but also politically. In the history and in current China, if the political atmosphere is different, then the outcome could be different. So my question is, considering the history and the present China, you think what role of politics played in the propagation of a religion? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Actually, I do not use success and failure in the sense of estimated numbers or anything else. I just want to emphasize that the success for Buddhism is not only the influencing of daily life, but not as my name, but it is taken as a Chinese Buddhism instead of India Buddhism in China. That is a key point. So I prefer to accept the analysis of Chen Yinque and Fang Lidian, the elder generation, because they emphasize the importance to make it merged into Chinese own tradition, to make it really legitimate in the context, not as a foreign thing, a borrowed thing. So I mentioned, actually, we are quite strong in making the borrowed things and learned things internalized. But anyway, I think even though things has been improved and it is changing, but not yet accepted, for instance, the Catholic tradition, at the local tradition, at the local religion in China. That is what I mean by success or failure. Actually, success or failure is not my term, but it's a remark by Schuschker. I do not think Buddhism is really so successful, to be honest. Yeah. Thank you.
Good morning, Professor Yang. 梁老师您好. I'm a student of a master's program in Trinitarian ontology at Instituto Universitario Sofia and in philosophy in Universitario Perugia. I have a question for you. I'm very interested in the concept of 实铁生, this concept of 昼信基督夜信佛, believing Christ in the daytime and believing Buddhism in the nighttime. And he explains that the major difference of the two religions actually lies in the concept of sufferance. The daytime corresponds the Christianity in which suffering is a permanent situation and which correlates to salvation, hope. Instead, the nighttime, which corresponds to Buddhism, which relates to reincarnation, and it's actually escape from it. So that's why the people will want to escape from it in nighttime, and we want to remain in this concept of hope and salvation in the daytime. So I'm actually interested, would there be any common ground between Buddhism and Christianity properly in this concept of sufferance? And if this would be facilitated for the Christianity to inculturate more deeply into the Chinese society. And so if I explain myself, yeah, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Actually, in the full text of my presentation in English and Chinese offered some description and analysis about Shi Tiesheng's article. So I like to send it to you as your reference. And on the other hand, I think it's quite strange. Shi Tiesheng compared with Buddhism and Christianity in the case of kindergarten in the morning and in the afternoon. He described that if you are elder some years later, if you have the experience to send your kid to kindergarten, you may understand that. He said that all the boys and girls refused, do not really like to be sent to the kindergarten. So they cried and they begged and do a lot of things, technical things, but the parents has to send them to the kindergarten. So that is the experience of suffering from the real life. So he believed it is a similar form for the Christian tradition. But in the afternoon, when the parents meet with their children in the gate of the kindergarten, everything has been changed greatly. And no crying, no begging, and yeah, that is the similar function of Buddhism. And another thing I think might be necessary for you to take as a reference is that you know that there's a quite famous saying by Socrates that the life unexamined is not worth living. But you know that a Chinese wise man, a Chinese philosopher, added this with another typical Chinese sentence. He said, yes, it is true, the life unexamined is not worth living, but the life examined carefully is sometimes quite hard to live. I think that is why rcher described two experiences, religious or non-religious. So for your reference, thank you.
My name is okay. My name is Thomas. I am a student of missiology department of this university. My question is to Professor Yang. You said Buddhism that came from India became part of the Chinese tradition without much resistance. But whereas Christianity still remains a kind of a foreign element, my question is, Christian missionaries like Matteo Ricci tried to adapt to the Chinese culture, what we call the inculturation or adaptation. That was an attempt to make it, to give Christianity a Chinese identity. What do you think, or where do you think Matteo Ricci didn't function well, or where he went wrong with his inculturation activities?
Thank you. Actually, Matteo Ricci, the first book for Matteo Ricci published in China is 天主十义, some doctrines for, I'm not so sure the English title. But anyway, I think in that book is a typical case for a Christian missionary to preach, to persuade the Chinese intellectuals in accordance with Chinese philosophical resources. It's quite interesting. So the argument between the missionaries and Chinese intellectuals could be quite attractive for Chinese readers, because they use many, many resources and quotations from Chinese classics. Anyway, the second book, a translated book by Matteo Ricci, is 25 言, which is a part translation from Epictetus, the moral teaching of Epictetus. That is almost nothing to do with traditional Chinese resources, but with some moral teachings from the West. So I think Matteo Ricci sent a quite interesting example to combine the two learnings together to, in the talk, in the discussion, and the argument with Chinese intellectuals. Anyway, the reason why I emphasize that the Buddhism in China seems to be, in some sense, more successful. What I mean is that the Buddhist scriptures have been taken for a long time as Chinese classics, as a part of Chinese philosophical resources. Even though Matteo Ricci began to do a similar thing, but in this sense, I think the Catholic missionaries did not take the success as whatever has got by the Buddhist monks. Yeah, thank you.
My name is Erik. I'm a professor of Sinology at the University of Gothenburg. I'm one of the speakers tomorrow. Very fascinating talk, Professor Yang, and the reply as well. I was wondering about the modality or the mode of religious expression in China. It hasn't been really mentioned, but it relates also to authenticity. How are, if you may say so, Chinese people religious? Because that is a very important factor. Also with the duality that you mentioned with rcher's daytime Christianity, evening Buddhism, an openness to have several traditions at once. And also, of course, the issue of what is religious and what is faith in that sense. And how do you express this in a Chinese way? So can you comment a bit on that? And also the issue of, I mean, people say Chinese are not religious, but in my expression, as 25 years of Chinese studies, Chinese are very religious. Religion is very important in Chinese life, but not in perhaps the way that Western Europeans are used to. Different expressions and modality in that sense.
Is it addressed to both the speakers? Okay, we start with the Dr. Lagliarotti.
No, please.
Okay.
I've already talked too much. Yeah, thank you for the question anyway. And yeah, well, first something linked to the previous question actually about Matteo Ricci, because I mean this kind of contact of what Matteo Ricci did, it was also something that he tried several times. What was the best way to go through this, to this, yeah. There is a very interesting expression of Erik Zurcher, actually, which called cultural imperative. That every kind of religion that or cultural, I don't know, yeah, that wanted to go inside China, they have to be careful about this cultural imperative. I mean, and this is linked with this kind of religiosity of the Chinese people, no? Because I mean, it is something that's what I try to say also to this example of the Yulanpian Hui, that of course Buddhism has been. I totally agree with this. That I mean, this translation of the Buddhist of Buddhism with this Confucian thought made by the elites, it's very important. And this happened, and this is something that, for example, Christianity never had the chance to have till now, we can say this. But it's also true that there were some, according to me, there were some symbolic backgrounds in Buddhism. And also because, I mean, the Buddhism didn't come just from one place we go. But I mean, it's kind of a very slow movement from India to all the neighboring and the border. Now, there were other spaces with other, you can say, culture or cultural environments. So it has gone through a very slow translation and interpretation. For example, I mean, I always have this kind of idea in mind. This idea of Guanyin, which is a male, actually. He's a Avalokiteshvara, and he's a Bodhisattva in the Indian tradition, a man that became a woman in the Chinese context. And a goddess, one of the most important, actually. Yeah, I don't know, I did field work for so many years in Taiwan, and in each house in Taiwan you have this altar, and you have Guanyin at the center of the altar, and then the ancestor just besides. And I think that this is very important. And also this kind of idea of the importance, I think it's very, very important. This kind of idea, there will be, just because next month another conference in Germany about the importance of Zhu Xi and his idea of family rituals. And I think that this is really something very thick in Chinese culture. I mean, I'm doing research about ancestors in China, this idea of ancestors in China. And this is, for me, it could be considered, should be considered as a kind of cultural imperative. That, I mean, you want to go, you want to touch this territory, you have to be able at least to set up a dialogue with this very strong idea, yeah, of ancestors worship, xiao, the concept of filial piety. This is, are religious concepts or just civil context? I mean, this is something that has been argued so long, and I think that there is not a clear answer till now, but yeah,
If I could just add one thing to the question of Frederick, I would say that in accordance, the most interesting thing in the article for Shi Tiesheng is not take Buddhism or Christianity as a alternative. It's not, but I think the deepest influence for Buddhism is that the basic interpretive form of the article by Shi Tiesheng is actually very, very Buddhist. So that is the influence. Sometimes you cannot not recognize from the appearance, but actually logically and interpretively, it has been already turned into a Buddhist way. So I think that is a space for the Kerygma. The Kerygma cannot be only taken as a preaching in limited human languages, and cannot be only understood as a way for convert somebody else. Thank you.
Just add one more word. I really, what I appreciated actually about the paper of Professor Xiang is just to try to develop this idea that Kerygma should be something that embodied all it's not only the preaching or the theological level, but the everyday life of people. Just bring this concept as a way of life, not only as a doctrine. And I appreciate it really very much.
Professor Maria De Giorgi? Ah, okay. So next to you, the father over there.
Indunil from Sri Lanka Pontifical Council for Interreligious Dialogue. Thank you very much for both speakers for your thought-provoking presentations. What I want to underline is one factor is the diffusion of the successful story of Buddhism. Can it be the political patronage? For example, when there is political patronage, Buddhism flourishes. And also in the course of history, Buddhism was banned and also branded as a foreign religion. So the diffusion and the successful story, political patronage also matters. That's the one observation. The other one is with regard to Christianity didn't take root or found it difficult to penetrate. Would it be compared to Latin America, when Christianity arrived, already there were three main religions: Taoism, Confucianism, and Buddhism. And so that would be a difficulty for Christianity to penetrate. Third observation is when it comes to authenticity and also guardians of tradition, Buddhism also has the same concept. For example, Buddhism also have had different councils to decide on the authenticity of the Buddha's teaching. Thank you.
Would you like to respond?
Yeah. How to say? I think sometimes the influence of a tradition to another one could be described in a superficial way, but also possible to offer another analysis or description on a deeper level. So I think actually the Buddhism and Christianity met similar questions in the social political context in China historically. But anyway, I think some Buddhist philosophers, or not only monks, they entered the kernel system for Chinese metaphysics. And that means even some of the conceptual tool for Chinese philosophy, also for Confucianism, have been provided by Buddhist scriptures. That is the potential influence on the much deeper level. Yeah, that is whatever I would like to emphasize. And on the other hand, your question reminded me of a novel by a Japanese novelist. His Chinese name is Yuanteng Zhouzuo. I'm not so sure how to pronounce it in English or in Japanese. His most famous book is The Silence. You know, The Silence. Edo. Yeah. I think that is a description of the true religious experience in a much deeper level compared with others, even in the Japanese context. Yeah. So that means even in the Japanese context or any other context, Christianity could be possibly interpreted in a similar superficial way. Thank you.
Would you like also to just comment? Make a comment?
Just this idea that this concept of the political power, guardian of traditions, authenticity as well, played. We tried to say that we played a very huge role in this process of diffusion of Buddhist in China, but really I think that the very basic point of Professor Yang was that it is important that not consider it Buddhist only as a religion, as a doctrine, but really as a practice, something that you have to live. And I will just give some thought about this because I mean, I have been in Taiwan doing my research, and I did also some research about the Buddhist communities. There are quite a few big communities, Guangshan, Fagushan. And then I think that this is, you can read this idea of Professor Yang in the other way. I mean, in the opposite way. I mean, the Buddhists that became and learned from the West, from the church, to become a structure, to become a church, and become a doctrine. Again, it's not only a way to live, and it's just it's really an establishment and a building of a new religion, let's say, concept. Yeah.
I think we are now ending the session. Maybe, if I may, one last question I would make to the Professor Yang and maybe also Dr. Lazzarotti is about, you mentioned this merging, integration of Confucianism and Buddhism and the mutual enhancement of this process and the result. There is a phenomenon also on the part of the local Christian communities who have been integrating Chinese traditional practices and rituals as part of their own modalities to live Christianity, to live faith. Is it a similar process, hence leading to mutual enhancement as well, or there is a difference?
Very good question and quite provoking and stimulating. Anyway, I have to prepare another presentation to answer such a question. Yeah, actually, I happened to just finish a paper about the reading of Michael Foucault and Materlizzi about the text, the moral teachings by Epictetus. I think that is a quite interesting comparison between the two masters, but quite different perspectives. But anyway, it could be provoking for Chinese scholars, at least at one point, that some classical resources could be properly reinterpreted in accordance with modern philosophy, religious or non-religious, Western or Eastern. Yeah. So that is a potential quite large and promising space for theological studies in any context, I think. Yeah. Thank you.
Because I was also quite fascinated by that example you made of the pre-Buddhist festival that acquired a new meaning. So talking about local communities, local Buddhist communities that gave a new meaning to, a new Buddhist meaning to the pre-Buddhist festivity. Yeah. So would you like to also comment on this? I mean,
yeah, that was just basically an example just to say that how Buddhist, I mean, I totally agree that this was this strong political push, that this dialogue at the level of the elites was very important. But what I would like to say is that even at the level of the normal people, so what Frederick was actually asking about this religiosity of the Chinese people. I mean, Buddhist had the chance to adapt itself better because, I mean, played to some symbolic background that were already, I would like to say, almost ready to accept this message. And this sometimes didn't happen with Christianity because, I mean, you bring concepts quite different. Sometimes I really feel like St. Paul, when he went to Athens for the first time, that he started to talk about philosophy, a lot of stuff, and everybody, oh yeah, good point. And then Jesus rise again. Okay, you're just kidding. Let's talk about eating another, no? And then I think that for me this is it's very interesting because, I mean, is this really, I mean, as human beings, we are able to understand the reality only through our symbolic capacities. Because we say that culture is something that is historically transmitted and socially maintained. When something new arrived, of course, I mean, it's normal to use our cultural background to understand it. And if something you don't understand, if you don't understand, it's something that, okay, this is something that I cannot take, I cannot accept. So I think that this is the further step. Maybe Christianity should make. Yeah.
okay, thank you very much to our distinguished panelists. I think a round of applause.